I don't really have to introduce Aaron because he is the biggest guy in the room. But Aaron started at Hewitt. Hewitt does a lot of the outsourcing for benefit programs for most organizations. And when Aaron started at Hewitt, they did not have a head of learning. They did not have a chief learning officer. It's like the barber who has the bad, doesn't cut their hair. They do everybody else's. But Aaron teamed up with one of their partners who became their CLO and has just done phenomenal with developing just incredible development programs. And then a few years ago, Aon bought Hewitt. And so Hewitt was a great organization, but Aon is a very large organization and has a very, I think there was like 600 or 800 acquisitions of different companies that built Aon. And their strategy and what they're doing is pulling that all together. And we're thrilled to have Aaron share not only his insight with leading with strategic thinking, but he wrote the book on it too. Thank you, Aaron.
This is a real pleasure. And I've actually had a chance to do a lot of presentations recently because of this book. I was actually in Wharton on this day last week, and we did something on the radio with them. And I've been doing, I'll be doing a program tomorrow in association with Crane's Chicago Business. But actually, this one's really special to me, and actually, the way Dirk teed it up is really why. I have a long history with this organization that Dirk's been building, and with a lot of folks in the room. So it's very fun to be able to be here and to talk about this work that I've been doing around what it means to lead strategically. So I hope you get two things out of this, given this audience. First, some of you, many of you probably, think about leadership in your organizations and have some sort of role to play there, right? You are either creating programs to do leadership development, you're advising the business on how to lead, you are coaching folks on how to develop the next generation. I'm going to find a bunch of ways, I think, to build in Kevin's points, because I think there's some really interesting stuff there around empowerment and the next generation of leadership that's coming up. So that's the first thing. I think we can talk about how do we develop leaders given our role. The second thing, and I think I really encourage you to focus on, and I'm going to actually get really specific about this, is we're all leaders in this room, and I encourage you to think about this as it applies to yourself. Because one of the things we really emphasize in the class at Northwestern that preceded this, and now in writing this, is everybody has the opportunity to lead, and I think actually everybody has an obligation to lead. It's just a question of how. And what I really want to focus on today is how do you lead, given the work that you do, and how could you lead more effectively? And how can you think about the most strategic opportunity in the role you have, including not limiting yourself to the role that you're in? Because I think actually your role is just a starting point. It's the ticket in to start being influential in your organization, but there's a lot of things that opens the door for. And I think the most effective leaders we looked at were ones who didn't look at, they didn't limit themselves to the impact that they could have, and I'll be giving you some examples around that. So, thank you, for being here, and it was just fun to see books around. So I'm very eager to hear feedback today and afterwards. And let's go ahead and get started. So this class does come out of some work that I had to do with a gentleman who is a doctorate in education. We teach at Northwestern in the School of Education and Social Policy. Our class is called Leading with Strategic Thinking. So I'm not the chief marketing officer like Kevin is. I just, go very literally, and the class was called this, so the book became called, became the same name. We were not probably doing enough time spending on, how to market this creatively. But, in this program, we're actually teaching folks much like you. It's the Masters in Learning and Organizational Change. And there's some folks in the room like Jane who have connections to this program over the years, as do I. And this is folks who are thinking about the same things you focus on. How do we make organizations more successful? How do we help contribute to organizational capability and help drive the strategy? And this class came out of the fact that, as we talked to alumni of this program, one of the areas that they wish they had more content on was strategy. So we created a class around that, and we said, let's create a class that is credible to an MBA program, but focuses on the things that we really care about as learning and org change professionals. And so we don't go as much into the finance side of things, but we go much more into how things actually happen in organizations. And we actually take it from a learning standpoint, because this is the School of Education at Northwestern. And so I start with this slide, because this is a bit of what we focus on in this graduate class. It is also some things that we work on at Aon, and we teach this program both at Northwestern, and we actually take parts of it, and we also teach it for other organizations. And we like to start with some very fundamental concepts. And I'm going to spend just a very time on this before I turn the corner to what it means to lead strategically. There are three things that we have found are really at the heart of being strategic. And you see them on one side of the slide. You see it's really about recognizing patterns, seeing things in the data that indicate what is going on in the environment. Now, data can mean a lot of things. It can mean quantitative data, it can mean facts and figures, it can mean inputs that you see through observation, it can mean what you bring to it from your own experience. But it's really what we find when we look at people who are the most strategic, they're really good at pattern recognition. And they actually focus a lot on pattern recognition. What's going on here? What are the things that I've seen before? Or how is this different than what I've seen before? How is the pattern that I'm seeing now different than the past? Because that might mean we need to handle and look at things differently. This then leads to the second critical thing. This one's almost obvious, but I think it's actually very important to talk about, and that's making good decisions, making choices. The most strategic leaders know how to make decisions effectively. They take a structured approach often to thinking through the choices that they make, focused on what's going to create the most value here? What is going to contribute in the most important way? Because there are always choices. And I think actually, much like pattern recognition, effective leaders realize choices that other people don't. Sometimes we fall into traps of just doing what we've done before and not realizing that we're making a choice then too. So this idea of making choices is the second thing that we teach. And then the third thing is managing risk. Strategic leaders know that any choice is a trade-off. And in making trade-offs, you're trying to maximize value and minimize risk, which is going to undermine that value. It's always there. And strategic thinking involves identifying that risk and taking steps to mitigate each of the risks. What are the things that are going to maybe cause us to fail here? And what are the things that we can do to counteract each of those? So these are the three core actions. Very simple, but very under the covers, rather sophisticated things that go into being strategic and thinking about things strategically. Now, on the other side of the slide, we get into more of the academic side of this. How can you do those things well? And we think of strategic thinking as the intersection of three things: cognitive psychology, systems thinking, and game theory. Now, why did we pick those? First, because when we talk about strategy in our class and strategic thinking in our class, we find that most people first, at the beginning, struggle with a definition. And I actually think it's because it's not easy to define strategic thinking itself. It's much easier, like this Venn diagram, to think of it as the intersection of doing a number of things well. And these are very rich and increasingly sophisticated disciplines that can help you do that well. So you have something like game theory, and for simple purposes here, I'll just compare that to chess. And how can you think of the moves that you have to make in chess, or the moves that you make in the work that you do, multiple steps ahead of time? And great chess players, great chess masters, actually are good at anticipating not just moves that they should make, but the moves that other players are going to make, whether it's one person that they're playing against or multiple parties. And game theory brings a lot of science to this. And increasingly with big data, we find it's more and more possible to apply concepts of game theory to making decisions well. In fact, talent decisions, the kind of decisions that we make. And I think Kevin would probably be able to do at least a half day if we gave him the time on how big data is going to inform and drive decision making in the field that we're all in. And that's true across all fields. So that's where we focus on when we talk about game theory. Systems thinking, Peter Senge wrote a classic book called The Fifth Discipline on this. He identified to think systemically as part of what constitutes a learning organization. So again, very close to the heart of what this group cares about. And increasingly, I think executives are getting conversant about the fact that to be competitive, you have to be a learning organization. And that means being a systems thinker. What are the patterns and what are the cause and effects? Increasingly intertwined organizations in intertwined industries in an intertwined world. The ability to see those patterns, to see the system that's going on, actually makes people more effective and allows them to think more strategically. And then finally, cognitive psychology. The idea that the way we think informs the thinking that we do. And I'll just take one simple example here. If you know Thinking Fast and Slow, it was a very popular book a couple of years ago. That has popularized a concept of System 1 and Systems 2 thinking. The idea that actually there is intuitive decision making, and then there is structured decision making. And both are valid, and both are important. And increasing focus on the science of these two types of decision making, I think, are making leaders and organizations more effective. Because there's real value in just like there's real value in making an intentional and structured approach to making choices. So these are the three disciplines that we tend to focus on. This is what we teach at quite a bit in our class at Northwestern. This is also what we integrate in programs like we do at Aon. I just wanted to lay a little bit of groundwork because as I said, when I start talking about strategy and when I start talking about strategic thinking, I often find people don't feel real comfortable with the term. So spending a little bit of time terms was something I wanted to start off with. Now, for your sake, I think you can already start thinking here, okay, how do I do these three things in my work? To what degree is my job involved recognizing patterns? Probably a lot. If you're doing design of learning, your basic role starts with pattern recognition. And ADDIE and those kind of instructional design models give you a discipline and structure around how to begin that process. I think being self-conscious, how am I going about pattern recognition and what are the relevant data points that I can use is worth thinking about. Likewise, choices. How do the design choices or how do the organizational choices that we're making make sure that we're maximizing value? And then this idea of mitigating risk is one that I actually don't think we get a lot of discussion around. But we always need to think about execution risk. How is this actually going to go in the field once we've finished the process of designing and making all those upfront decisions? And how do we manage to make sure that those things don't undermine our success? So we took these concepts, and this book ended up focusing on how this gets applied then in the real world and what it means to actually be a leader who is strategic. And I'll start by saying I actually think leadership and strategy are really important to think about together. Because if you think about leadership but it's not informed by strategy, you can have a lot of impact, but you're not necessarily focusing on the right things. Strategic thinking makes leaders more effective because it makes sure that they're focusing on the right places and not going down the wrong path. Conversely, a strategist who doesn't lead creates a lot of great binders that sits on shelves. And I think that one of the key things that I get worried about when I look at people who are proposing strategy is that they focus on the power of the idea. And they assume that a good idea is going to win the day. And in fact, that is absolutely not true. It's a great idea combined with the ability to influence others to make it happen that actually reflects great strategy. One of the things that I think brings us to light nicely is the movie The Social Network. So this is the story of how Mark Zuckerberg created Facebook. And it focuses on the controversy between himself and others who took credit or thought they had deserved credit for that idea. And he's sitting in this with a bunch of lawyers in a room at one point in the movie. And he's been checked out of this whole process. He's very annoyed because he wants to be back at the office working on Facebook. But he finally engages in the group after just being dismissive. And he gets very passionate. And he says, you know what? If those folks had invented Facebook, they would have invented Facebook. And his point was, there were a lot of people with that idea. But the fact that Facebook prevailed over all the others is actually demonstration of the strategy being applied. It wasn't about the idea. It was actually about people successfully making it happen. And to me, that's the combination of strategy and leadership. So I want to use some examples around being a strategic leader, and I'm actually going to spend most of the rest of the time here talking about stories that we found as we pursued writing this book. Think about how you can relate to these stories, and I'm going to start with a couple of well-known examples. It's hard not to talk about Jack Welch. If you're going to talk about leadership, he gets a lot of credit, maybe more than he deserves. We'll leave that to you to decide on really being influential in the field of leadership, but you can't argue with his track record. He is synonymous with some of the most successful years of GE, and he is synonymous with GE's culture. Has anybody here worked at GE or at GE now? That means Bob's not here yet, okay. Bob's going to speak later, so I'm going to say great things about GE here, and you can tell him all about it. GE is known as an execution organization. as being able to drive strategy, right? And so they're very relevant for this discussion. And the way they drive strategy is very synonymous with their CEO. Jeff Immelt, now the CEO, was the successor to Jack Welch. Jack picked Jeff Immelt. And Jack and Jeff and the other CEOs have each had their own opportunity to make a unique imprint on the organization. But if you talk to anybody at GE and you talk about leadership, they're going to talk about the CEO. They're intertwined. The culture of GE is very much defined by the culture created by the chief executive. What are some impressions of GE's culture around leadership? Anybody want to offer up a couple? You have to speak up. Decisive, yes. Others? Market leaders, right? They're first. That's what they're gonna be first. They're not gonna play. What else? Inclusive, great. Consistent, right? These are the brand that they've created. Another one that you might come up with was innovation. Right? They've done a lot to invest in branding themselves around innovation, and they've done a lot of things around innovation, but in a very GE way. And consistency is what I'd point to as a big part of that. Contrast that to another very well-known organization that's been equally successful in its own right, 3M. Who knows the CEO of 3M? Probably not. Somebody might, but actually if I were to test you, probably more people would be able to name Jack Welch or Jeff Immelt than the CEOs of 3M. Why? Because actually the success of 3M is actually quite different than GE. If you know anything about 3M, you might know something like the story of the Post-it note. The Post-it note was created by an individual engineer who was working on adhesives, created one, and his goal was to make something really sticky, and it wasn't. So he kind of said, well, this was a failed experiment, and he put it on the shelf. And 10 years later, another engineer came along and said, I'm trying to find a way to temporarily attach two different things together. And he found this chemical that this previous engineer had worked on and realized, oh, this is actually kind of useful. And lo and behold, $1 billion business, was born. And story after story at GE or 3M is just like this. It's individual engineers spending a large portion of their time pursuing their own interests and experimenting. This is core to the way 3M works, and it's actually something they're famous for, is engineers get a lot of autonomy and individual time to pursue scientific interests. What they're really good at then as an organization is finding the promising opportunities and backing those and creating businesses around them. And I would put forward that is almost entirely the opposite of GE. A lot of GE's strategy comes from the top. And a lot of stuff at 3M comes from the front lines. And so they're approaching strategy in two very, very different ways. What's interesting is if you look closely now at GE, they're spending a lot of time actually investing in innovation. So they've actually embraced some things that I would say kind of have been at 3M for much longer, but they're doing it in a totally GE way. They have a thing called FastWorks, and it's a highly organized program that takes concepts from Silicon Valley and quickly creates a process to incubate new ideas. But it's done in a structured workshop in a room. And I think that is antithetical to the way 3M goes about innovation. 3M trusts, let's just get a lot of experiments going. And let's focus on analyzing and finding the right ones to put some resources behind. So both are successful. I'm not saying one is bad or the other. And actually the point is they're unique choices. So let's keep going. Oprah. I don't think you could argue against putting Oprah on a list of strategic thinkers. The amount of things that she has accomplished is really extraordinary. And what's clear is she has a vision that attracts people to what she's trying to do. And she has created a brand around herself and around the lifestyle that she's been able to identify that's enormously influential. There's a reason why she shows up on the top of almost every list around media influencers, because she has had a vision that has had huge impact. So you have to acknowledge that's highly strategic. This isn't luck, right? She's created this empire and media influence around herself. What I would highlight is, again, she's doing some things that nothing like Jack Welch and look nothing like 3M, and yet are very strategic. She's leading through a really unique power of the vision that she has. So finally, I want to go to my last person, and that is Nelson Mandela. So Nelson Mandela, I think you could argue easily, was also visionary, right? So I just got done talking about Oprah and her vision. You certainly have to acknowledge the visionary leadership of Nelson Mandela. But what I would like to highlight, just like contrasting GM and oh man, that's the first time I've done that. There's too many companies with acronyms that have a G in them. GE and 3M is, I think that Oprah and Nelson Mandela went about their work in very different ways. It's hard to argue that it's in Oprah's world, it's anything other than Oprah's world, right? This struck me when she started coming out with her magazine, and as I saw it all the time in the grocery store, what I noticed was Oprah is always on the cover of Oprah's magazine, right? You're in Oprah's world, right? Nelson Mandela, equally high profile, but I'll highlight one specific thing that he did when he became president of South Africa, is he created a thing called the Truth and Reconciliation Council. And he did this with Bishop Desmond Tutu, and what he did was really extraordinary, is he ceded power to a group that was in charge of figuring out a very, very difficult problem for the country. How do we make a peaceful transition to post-apartheid? And this is notable because I think it's a very big challenge in countries and nations around the world. You know, intractable differences that need to be overcome in some way. And I think what is unique about Nelson Mandela is he's one of the few people who deserves and has received credit for actually figuring it out. You know, for all the things that might not be perfect yet about South Africa, what you can't argue with is they have navigated a transition in a way that few other nations and cultures have been able to be able to say, look, we have this past, and we need to figure out how to deal with it, and we need to figure out how to move forward. What does that involve? That involves parties buying into the idea that it's time to move on and settle differences. This commission that was created was really central to it. It created a process where there was certainly restorative justice. There was certain things that needed to be done to address wrongs. So there was justice served. But just as importantly, there was a process where people could actually come to terms with their involvement in what happened during apartheid on their own terms. And what they actually allowed people to do was actually volunteer stories about things that people were a part of that they now actually wanted to express regrets about. And it gave people the opportunity to say, you know what, I was a part of this in one way or another, and you know what, now I'm looking back on it differently. And this was a very, not just cathartic process for individuals, but it was actually central to the idea of helping the country move forward, because it let people acknowledge things and say, you know what, it's about now us moving towards something very different. And I would just put forward that this is a very unique type of leadership that was highly strategic. And this is meant to be a joke, so don't take it wrong. I don't think Jack Welch would have managed his way through the transition that Nelson Mandela needed to in the same kind of way. I also don't think Jack Welch would have been successful. And I think it's because you can't tell people what to do to get through a process of moving past differences. It just doesn't work that way. And so here we have 4 leaders, all of whom I think are highly accomplished, and you can argue are highly strategic, but look nothing like each other. They approached things in ways that would not work if you try to take one and place them in the other. So it kind of left us with this dilemma as we started to work on this book. Okay, we wanted to write about what strategic leaders do. We came up with this nice little model that was on this previous slide. Oh, too far, I'm not gonna go all the way back. But like, okay, when we get to what strategic leaders do, it doesn't actually look very similar. Is it random? And so then we started to analyze it more closely. And what we did is we took a couple of concepts from the field of strategic management that I think really help explain what's going on here. If you look at the body of work around strategy, it really you could trace it all the way back to, The Art of War and, Machiavelli and all these great things that are actually very useful and very important. But a lot of the really good academic work on strategy started in around the 1930s and 1940s. And if you look at the collective body of work, there are really kind of 2 major things that have been analyzed that come out across it. The first is, how do you define your strategy? Strategy formation. Where are we going? And if you look at the body of work around that, you actually find there's 2 basic approaches that have emerged out of this, both equally credible. There are planned processes. These are very GE-style processes. We're going to get in a room, we're going to look at all the data, we're going to make some decisions, and we're going to decide where to go. That's planned strategy. Equally valid, though, is what's increasingly now be called emergent strategy. There was a professor, Henry Mintzberg, he's up in Toronto, who gained a lot of credit for having popularized this, because he basically looked at all the planned stuff and said, yeah, that sounds good, but as I go out and I look at, I do my academic work and I look at real life, this doesn't really happen. And he tells this great story about IKEA. IKEA, obviously a world leader in their own market. They became sort of dominant in this particular type of selling and distribution of furniture where everything comes packed flat. So you'd think like this must have been the most insightful management strategy session where they realized, oh, we have a market, we could actually do something really different here. No. Actually, it was some managers at some of the first stores that IKEA had who were packing a table into a truck for a customer. And somebody said, you know what? We just put the legs on before, now we have to take them off again. Seems like it would have been a lot easier just to leave them off in the first place. Boom, billion-dollar business, right? And IKEA is now sort of far and away distinct in what they do because they had a unique insight. It didn't come from a planned process. It came from trial and error in the field. And again, back to pattern recognition. Finding good data points that pointed to an opportunity and then figuring out how to take advantage of that. So that's emergent and planned strategy. The other major discipline around strategy is then how do you make strategy happen? Strategy execution. And so how are we going to get there is the other major question that strategic management tries to answer. And here too, there's again basic choices. There is an approach where somebody takes charge and makes it happen in a very directive way. And then there's participative methods of making it happen. How do we get people to come along? And I would continue to use the examples I had on the previous page and say, you know what, you can see these differences. If you take somebody like Jack Welch, or I'd say if you take somebody like Oprah, I think they have an opinion. And I think they're going to tell people what it is, and I think people are going to move that direction. But if you look at 3M and you look at Nelson Mandela, they were involving people in every step of the way. And that's just a fundamentally different way to pursue executing strategy. It's a different way of managing change. I actually think, this is the field of change management, so you all know something about this already. I think I would say probably, if I were to, guess, most people would say, yeah, participative strategy is the way to go. And certainly a lot of effort has been moving organizations towards this direction. I think the empowerment concept that Kevin was talking about is absolutely true. In the world that we live in, we need to empower more and more people. But there are certain times when somebody has to make a call. I think that it's worth not dismissing directive change management approaches sometimes, because at a certain point, either we don't have the time, there's a market or a business imperative to make a choice, or sometimes, there's a lot of opinions out there, and some voice needs to rise above them and make sure that we actually can make closure and bring decisions. So with these examples, you've already heard me started to relate it back to these examples. So let me just kind of close the loop here. If you take the idea of strategy formation and you link to these examples, you really have basic differences in how they're pursuing their strategy. And likewise, if you take strategy execution in mind, you again have basic differences in how they're pursuing making things happen. And I think this is the way to crack the code on why strategic leaders end up looking really different in different situations. They're leading in ways that fit what they're trying to do. They figure out how to think about these two questions. How am I going to figure out the right strategy, and how am I going to actually make it happen in ways that actually are reinforced and actually only happen because they choose to lead in a certain way. This is strategic leadership. We define strategic leadership, and what we focus on in this is how people make the right choice to lead to get something done, and the fact that there is no one definition of leadership. And if anything, I become more and more sensitized to the fact that at Aon, we have an Aon leadership model, and it's 5 things, and it applies to everybody. But actually, I'm not sure that those 5 things all apply the same way all the time. And I think that the interesting opportunity for all of us is to think about situational leadership in ways that increasingly focus on trying to apply the right type of leadership at the right time. It's putting leadership in context. I think that there's a lot of work that can be done here, and we started to sort of try to look at this more closely. So let me tell you some of the examples that we came up with when we looked at this question of what are the right ways to lead in different situations. So through this, we ended up defining and describing 4 different types of leadership, 4 different ways of leading, each tailored to unique situations. And then we asked the question, what do you actually do? What are the best practices in each of these 4 categories? So I'd like to just give you some of the examples that we came up with as we went through this analysis. We went out and we actually talked to 300 leaders to answer this question. We did focus groups. We hit 9 different countries. We were counting it as 10, but then we realized that Puerto Rico is actually not a country, so we made it back down to 9. No, we're still including Puerto Rico in it, though. It's just that obviously it doesn't count as a separate entity. And so from those 300 folks, we actually did surveys. We got them actually through into focus groups, and we said, think of somebody strategic, and then tell us what they did. And we actually got lots of great data back, lots of great stories, and we analyzed and sifted through it all, and we looked at the patterns across all of it, but then we also picked some of the best ones. So I'm going to share with you 4 stories that illustrate these with a focus on what these people did, because I think that actually one of the key things we want to highlight here is this is repeatable. I think a mistake is to think, you know what, Jack Welch is Jack Welch, and Oprah's Oprah, and so they're just the right person at the right time. No. People actually choose how to lead, and they make the right choice. And yeah, you find situations where it's just the right person in the right place, but I think that those you could chalk up to maybe a little bit of luck. The better leaders are the ones who figure out, like, you know what, I'm going to lead a little differently in this situation because I realize what I'm trying to accomplish, and I'm going to adapt my approach. So let's start with these examples. The 3 folks you see here, Eric, Danae, and Slava, created an organization, a company called Indiegogo. They're based out in San Francisco. They are a classic Silicon Valley startup. You either know them or you know Kickstarter. These are the organizations, the companies that have created platforms that have really changed how people raise funds to make things happen. So that was their challenge. They said, we want to disrupt the finance industry. And since they were 20-year-olds, they had the right to do it, right? Because they were in the right place, they were in Silicon Valley, and they were having this discussion over dinner. And one of them actually had worked in New York on Wall Street in finance, and they said, you know what? I don't feel good about there being these decision makers that decide how equity is dispersed and where opportunities are created. How could we democratize this? And so they did. They created Indiegogo, which preceded actually Kickstarter, and is one of the places you can go to fund your idea. And there's a wealth of cool ideas that are out there. You've probably seen a lot of things. Who in this room has ever backed something on Kickstarter or Indiegogo? Yep, see? And this is just an amazing change in how people have access to the funds they need to make ideas happen. It's a real meritocracy. So what did they do? How did they actually successfully lead? Well, they led through the power of their vision. The idea that they had has fueled their success. And they have a team of folks now who work on Indiegogo, all passionate about this idea. And they don't necessarily know where all the places are that it's going to go. Sometimes they've actually run into barriers. There's a bunch of legislative barriers, actually, that I learned about by talking to them that actually really hampered some of the things they wanted to do because there were regulations on how capital gets allocated in order to manage the finance industry. But they've found a way to manage around those, and they've sort of figured it out as they go. So what does that mean? Well, they were really good at 5 things. They were good at monitoring trends, gaining an insight that they realized, oh, there's an opportunity here. They created a solution, and then they quickly iterated on it. They were not committed to the original idea. And when they ran into these issues around what was legal and not legal in the finance industry, they quickly adapted. They were good at iterating and changing. And then finally, they were absolutely great at getting other people on board. And their hiring process, is really key to what they're doing because they need people who care a lot about this. And they were very articulate about what it means to be passionate about what they're doing and how they hire those folks and how, if you're just interested in being a part of a startup, but you don't really care about this mission that we're on, you're probably not the right person for us. So these are 5 things that distinguish all the examples that we had around leading through vision, one of the 4 types. Let's go to a second example. Liz Gerber, she's a fellow faculty at Northwestern. She's in the McCormick School of Engineering. And created this neat organization called Design for America. Design for America, which has been featured on Fast Company magazine, the cover in 2011, and has created a whole bunch of really interesting results of products that have been created by college students who focus on how to figure out solutions to social problems. And the first thing that they did working with Liz is they entered a design competition as they were getting this organization. She was kind of inspired by Teach for America, and then she had a lot of background at the D School out in California where a lot of concepts around design thinking came out of. And she thought, you know what, I don't think we teach design very well. I think it would be much better to get out of the classroom and get in the field and have students work on real problems. So she created this organization, and one of the first things they did is they entered a design competition focused on the challenge of getting children with diabetes to become more healthy. And so they entered this competition, and I think, as far as I can tell, there were 100 applications from different student organizations and student teams. 99 of them were for iPhone apps, because the iPhone was relatively new at this time, and everybody thought, oh, let's just create an app that helps people track their, taking their regimen for, as a diabetic. And these kids created a proposal around a teddy bear. And you know what? What we are going to do is we're going to create a teddy bear, and we're actually going to give it to the kid, and the teddy bear is a diabetic. And the kid is responsible for taking care of the bear and administering the regimen. And what they were able to find through prototyping and some research was that actually the child's compliance with their own regimen went up because they were empathetic and they started to understand what they needed to do because they knew they had to take care of this bear. And so here were some kids who were put on a big problem and developed this insight and were able to do something that was really revolutionary. And you can actually get this product now. It's called Jerry the Bear. And it's a robotic. It actually interacts with the kid now and all this kind of cool stuff. So this is a different type of leadership. This is actually Liz not leading the vision herself. She's actually empowering these students, much like 3M empowers its engineers. This is incubating leadership. So her challenge was, how do I not drive the vision myself? How do I actually empower others? Now I'll go back to Kevin's point around empowerment. I think incubating leadership is something that's overlooked. There are leadership characteristics, leadership actions that help you make other people be better leaders themselves. What are those? So there were 5 things that she and other incubating leaders we looked at were really good at. 1, she has a great network. She goes out and intentionally develops a network so that she has a set of resources available to her. 2, she's really good at judging opportunities. She's good at being able to say, you know what, that student has real potential, or this problem is one that I think that we should spend some time on. And she's very good at being selective around which ones to spend her time on. She then actually diversifies her bet. Incubating leaders don't focus on getting one thing and making that successful, like an Oprah example. They focus on, I'm going to put as many bets out there because that lets me then yield what I need and back the ones that are successful. Post-it notes was just one of thousands of experiments going on at 3M at the time. Liz also has lots of experiments going on with her student organization. And actually this Design for America organization that started at Northwestern has expanded, and it's on 27 different campuses around the United States now after a couple of years. She's then really good at lending assets. She empowers the students by giving them the resources that she has. It goes back to that network. She develops the network so that she actually can see the opportunities, cultivate them, but then say, you know what, you need some advice. I have somebody that actually I know that's an expert in this field. Let me connect you up with them. And then finally, she's creating a support ecosystem. Now, this is kind of implied by the previous one, by giving people support, but the best incubating leaders think not just of themselves as sort of brokering all of this, but they actually think, how do I create a system of support? And they've actually created this thing they call the Digital Loft that is really now the backbone of their organization, Design for America. And it's actually a platform where all the students at these different schools can go out and actually share and float their ideas and get feedback in real time as they're going. It's a feedback engine, basically. And that's a support ecosystem for them. And so I think that actually these are the 5 things that often leaders don't understand unless they're just intuitively good at it. But if you encourage somebody to think about when is it appropriate to actually lead not through your own vision but through empowering other people, there are some practical things that you can show people that are this incubating leadership type. All right, and then finally, Jose Ignacio, who I love to come back to as last, is because this guy is the classic Jack Welch leader. So Jose was in Mexico City at the time that P&G bought Gillette, and he was given a mandate. We need to bring these two organizations together quickly. And he was the CIO at the time for Latin America as a region, and he understood, like, this is a deadline, all right? And it is very obvious where we need to go. Nobody needs to have a real discussion about that, but getting there is gonna be real tricky, and it's a combination of speed and partnership. And so he really, I think, is somebody who's in a situation where they need to exercise some directive leadership. He was the person in charge. But what I think was interesting is he didn't just tell people what to do. And I think that's a misunderstanding of directive leadership. What he actually did was he thought about, how do I create the structure to make the team successful? So the things that he did was he set the direction. He basically was the one to say, look, there is a mandate here. I'm the one accountable for it, and we're going to get there together. Next, he established governance. One of the most important things he talked about was he's like, we needed to set up the team and define roles. And if you've ever been in a merger and acquisition or divestiture, you know that one of the most important things that you can do is get clear on who's doing what, because that is by no means obvious. And there's all kinds of swirl around this, including the politics that go with those kind of changes. And he was very savvy about saying, okay, I see the opportunities to create structure that help people get their work done in times where that's ambiguous. Then he focused on motivation. How do we create the right incentives and avoid disincentives? He monitored performance, and then, and I think this is sort of where it all comes together, he made the right choices on where to intervene. Once he'd set up the governance, the best thing he could do is just get out of people's way. And being a directive leader doesn't mean meddling in other people's work, because actually the best thing you can do is sometimes let the smart people with the right responsibilities figure it out themselves. But what he knew he needed to do was then focus on how it was going, and at certain times intervene and say, you know what, time out. I don't think this is actually going the direction it should be, so I'm gonna overstep, you know, the normal governance here, and I'm gonna intervene. And I think actually the best leaders that take this directive approach know that it's actually the really careful choice around when to intervene and override things that that is the heart of being a good directive leader. Because if you overdo this, people won't trust the system. They're saying, oh, well, you know, it's kind of random because every once in a while the leader's just gonna step in and kind of make the call. So it's really up to them. But also you can't let it go too long, because sometimes things are headed in the wrong direction and you need to actually call a timeout. So these are the four different types of leadership in a little bit more detail. We go into it a lot more in the book, and we use these stories and others to illustrate this. Oh, I wasn't done, there's a fourth one. Last one, Brian Fitzpatrick. So Brian is an engineer at Google, and this is a story around collaborative leadership. So his challenge that he chose personally after joining Google in 2001, a little bit after their IPO, was he said, you know what, I'm going to take on something that I see as a real opportunity, and that is, it is really hard for people to stop using Google. Now, there's two aspects to this. You probably identify with this because you've already used Google today. That's just my hunch, right? And it's because it is the go-to place to find the information you need. And yet what he observed is there's that, which is actually good. They're just doing a really good job, a better job than other places. But there were other situations where it was hard to leave, but for a different reason. It wasn't quality, it was because sometimes Google gets your information and it's hard to get it back. And whether it's Gmail or photos or documents, you know, Google actually has a lot of control over personal information. And what Brian decided to focus on was, you know what, we shouldn't take unfair advantage of that. We actually need to be honor our customers' choice and actually make it easy for them to control and manage their own information. And so what he did was he went around from product owner to product owner and made the case for this, saying, you know what, have you thought about how people can leave your product? And most of the time people said, no, and I'm not sure why I want to have a conversation with you about this, because that was not high on their list. But he actually made the case that we should win on quality. We should not win on forcing our customers to feel like they don't have a choice to leave. And he got a few people to buy into this. Engineers are sometimes a little bit, you know, they have an anti-authoritarian streak, so a few of them thought like, heck yeah, let's strike a blow for the users. And he kind of got a few examples going. And the turning point was when he got a critical mass and he got attention of Eric Schmidt, the actual, at the time, CEO, now chairman of the entire company. And he got Eric Schmidt's attention because Google was facing more and more pressure from regulators, saying, you guys are really big in your space. And in fact, as regulators, we're a little bit worried about that. Are you competing in a fair way, or are you guys a monopoly? And actually, if you know anything about antitrust law, it's not illegal to be the biggest. It's illegal to take advantage of being the biggest. And what Eric Schmidt saw in Brian's work was, this is actually good for us. If we make it easy for people to leave, what we can then show to regulators is we're acting in good faith. We have a lot of users because people like it, not because we're making them use it. And so Eric gave Brian the backing he needed, and actually what they ended up creating is something you can use today. It's google.com/takeout. And if you go there, you actually get a checklist of all the different products that you have information in at Google, and you check the ones you want, you hit a button, and it'll shoot your data back out for you, and you can actually take it out and bring it to some other place, like Yahoo if you want to. Brian did this with a team, of course, that had to do it, but he made this happen by himself. And my point is, he had no authority or responsibility to do this. He was an engineer among the thousands of engineers, but he saw an opportunity because he looked at what was going on, and he did a really good job of then honing in on that and saying, how can I make this happen without having any authority? And the key to making it happen was collaboration. He knew how to lead in a way that invited people into the process and said, I can't do this alone, but there's a good reason for us to do it together. And he then got them to do it with him. The 5 things that he did was he had to build relationships. He had a really great network across Google, probably, definitely I can say, having looked at it, better than other engineers. He then knew how to listen. He was listening to pick up the patterns, but he also demonstrated and built trust by the people by being a good listener. He found mutual interests. Where are those engineers that I actually want to collaborate with me? He actually had an engineering team that he started to build up, and he could actually help folks get work done so that it wasn't a burden on them to do some of these things. And then finally, he demonstrated trust. He said, you know what, I am not going to figure this out by myself. I'm going to share that power with you, and I'm going to lead with the trust so that you can learn to trust me. These 5 things were true across all of these folks that we found that we defined as collaborative leaders. People who knew that the key wasn't telling people what to do, the key was demonstrating that you and I can get something done together that neither of us can do separately. Much like Nelson Mandela's story, where he couldn't make that happen by himself. He needed to open up a process that other people got to participate in. So now let me start to bring this to a close. These 4 types of leadership, I think, are unique approaches to getting things done. The key is picking one that fits what you're trying to do. And again, I'll say, we all have choices in how we lead. Yeah, we might have some natural preferences and tendencies and personality traits that end up putting us in one of these more than others as our natural mode. But the best leaders that we saw knew, I need to act here in a way that actually fits what I'm trying to get done. That might be a little different. It might mean me changing it up some. So as you think about this, these are the 3 things that I would encourage you to focus on. 1, what is you trying to get done? Intent is central to this. If you can figure out what you're trying to accomplish, that's going to be the biggest thing to help you think through the right way to lead. And this is different than picking your strategy. It's very related, but intent includes figuring out how we're going to pick our strategy. I think that too often people think, okay, first I'm going to come up with what needs to be accomplished, then I'm going to think about how to work with other people. It's too late at that point. A lot of stuff around participative change management shows that the earlier the better as far as getting people involved. So be self-conscious about that. What are we trying to accomplish here? I might have a training program that I'm trying to introduce, but is it also important that people buy into the training program? Because if it's just a good idea, but nobody actually thinks it's something that can happen, or they're not bought into it, it's not going anywhere. So your goal is to think through, what is my strategy around this training program? What should it look like? But also, how do I think about the full definition of success, which means in the end, people buying into my proposal. Second is context. Cultures, teams, countries, these are huge variables in this. And there was the great question that Charlotte asked about, how do we think about learning in different cultures? That's context. And I think the best leaders think about all these variables, but then they say, what's going to work? Because there are things that are credible in one context that will lack credibility in another. And the idea of operating in this participative, collaborative way probably plays out very different in cultures that are hierarchical. than ones where there's a lot of feeling of empowerment. So you have to figure out, how am I going to adapt my leadership style with that in mind? And then finally, role. We all choose the role that we have. And I think that, as I said at the beginning, take the role that you're in as a starting point, but it's not the limit of what you can accomplish. Think about, what is the opportunity here to solve a problem, and how can I play a role in that? And again, I think we all have a great opportunity because we're in roles that help organizations be successful. There are a lot of problems in organizations. That means there's lots of opportunities for all of us. And I think by being in the conversation, you have the opportunity to figure out, what are the biggest problems that we can be solving, and how can I play a role in that? And that might not be what you were originally asked to do. It might be something different. So those are the three variables I encourage you to reflect on. And so then I'll just take you back to this. I would say, think about what you're doing today. Think about how you've been leading. And then ask yourself, am I leading in the best way I could be? Or do these kinds of examples and these two big questions maybe point to the fact that I could lead in a different way and get better results? Because that's really what I think this is all about. It's all about, thinking strategically in order to create the best outcome and the most meaningful impact that we all can. We're all in a position to have a huge impact in what we do, but it really requires being an effective leader, and being an effective leader means making strategic choices about how to lead. So that's what I wanted to talk about. I appreciate the chance to come and talk with you all about it, and I really enjoy, again, being with this group because I've got history with the group, and it's just fun to be able to talk about a topic like this with you. So thank you.